Hi, my name is Rod Smith, and I have an education project called the Natural Philosopher, a curriculum for ecological intelligence. The Natural Philosopher, in one aspect, is a toolkit for learning. My good friend Patrick McManus of DiscoverGenius.com calls it a Swiss Army knife for your mind. And what it is a little set of tools that is comprised of a knowledge diagramming system along with a set of pictograms. And with those two tools, you can map the content of any knowledge system, and it is a great, great learning tool. I took a degree in mechanical engineering from North Carolina State University in 1983 and went into the engineering business out of college. And I lasted about a year and a half, and I've done a couple more stints in the business as well, and was always horrified. Oh, thanks, yeah. Always horrified to find what I found with regard to our technological civilization, and that is that the running of it is absolutely mad. As I mentioned earlier, I was educated as a mechanical engineer, and one thing that I realized some years after my graduation and after I'd been working for a while is that there is no teaching model that allows engineering students to learn how to integrate technology into the natural environment. That does not exist. There are teaching models for building automobiles. There are teaching models for building nuclear power plants like Fukushima. Another aspect of the Natural Philosopher is that it addresses this issue. And it goes about it in very much the same way that Buckminster Fuller went about that. And that was through the creation of not just an epistemology, not just a theory of knowledge, not just knowledge about how knowledge works, but an epistemography. Okay, one that is drawn out, is diagrammed, and that step into that mode of representation is a really big step for the practical use of what is a very practical subject, and that is epistemology. The Natural Philosopher is, at its core, an adventure in epistemology. Epistemology is a subset of philosophy, supposedly, that addresses knowledge of knowledge. So we're studying how knowledge itself works, regardless of the content of that knowledge, whether it's naturalist studies or mathematics or music or whatever. Epistemology addresses all of these subjects. And I got turned on to the concept of epistemology initially, sort of unknowingly, and that was by reading a book called The Glass Bead Game in college. A book by Hermann Hesse, and he won the Nobel Prize for that in 1946. And the Glass Bead Game tells the story of this province in the not too distant future in what's probably Germany or Switzerland that's totally dedicated to scholarship. And over the years a game evolved that used a set of glass beads that allowed, okay, let me take a step back. This province totally dedicated to scholarship, you can go there and pursue whatever your arcane intellectual interest is, and are supported in that culture building activity. So they have a game, the Glass Bead Game. And the game is such that a mathematician can play a geographer, can play a theologian, can play an artist, because the beads in some way allow for the crosstalk that would be necessary for such a thing to happen. So that was my initial inspiration for what has become the Natural Philosopher, was the Glass Bead Game. In either 1988 or 1989, I began being mentored by a fine gentleman named Don Barry, who I met on Vashon Island under very auspicious circumstances one night in a wood-fired sauna on the west side of Vashon at Fern Cove. And a conversation began in the sauna that night that led to essentially the creation of this project. And what we started talking about that night was the Pythagorean approach to music and mathematics that I've since spent a lot of time and energy working on. And the conversation evolved to the more general subject, and that more general subject is epistemology. And Don was the guy who pointed out to me that what it was that I was interested in, this knowledge about knowledge, is called epistemology. Things really came together for me in terms of plugging into an epistemological stream or an epistemological approach that really worked for me, and that came about through the discovery of the work of a gentleman named Gregory Bateson, who throughout his intellectual career sought to answer the question, how does nature think? How is nature processing information? Because that's working and what we're doing is not working. So what he ended up doing was developing what we could call an ecological epistemology, okay, a theory of knowledge that works the way nature works, that puts ideas together and structures together in the way that nature does. And come up next, we'll have a short little segment that again Richard shot with actually Patrick McManus and I at the Center Forest on Vashon Island, where we discuss this issue and Bateson's ideas. And this was some part of some film that we shot for the Buckminster Fuller 2013 application that we submitted in April of 2013. So a couple of heads ups in terms of this next little video chunk. I use two terms that are not that commonly used, and I'd like to define those for you before we go into this little segment. And one of those terms is isomorphism and isomorphic. The prefix iso means same, and morph means form. So isomorphic means same form. So an analogy, for instance, is the same form as something else. A dream, we say that we have a particular dream and it means something else, right? It's isomorphic to some experience in our lives. Fractals are isomorphic to each other at different resolutions. So isomorphism means same form, put together the same way. And the other word that I use here that's not real common, not used in this way particularly, is the word abstraction. And the particular definition of the word abstraction as I employ it in this little segment has to do with how we build knowledge upon layer of knowledge. For instance, we start with letters and we put syllables together, and we put syllables together and make words, and we put words together and we make sentences. And the sentence then is going to determine which sorts of words go into it, and etc. Right? There's this building of structure and then this feedback between them. And so steps of abstraction are refer to those building of the levels. So have a look at this and let me know through email or whatever how it worked for you. Okay, thanks.
All right, go.
So we see these levels of structure everywhere: cell, tissue, organ, body system, organism, ecosystem, climate zone. That way of ordering, that way of self-ordering, we can map onto lots of natural phenomena. We can map it onto physics.
Right.
And that's was Bateson's insight, that human systems of abstraction, our processes of building knowledge, are isomorphic to natural form in the way it builds itself. So whereas we have cell, tissue, and organ in the biological context, in the geometric context, we have point, line, plane. So Bateson's insight was to see that nature's process of building layer upon layer of structure is exactly isomorphic to how human abstraction works. And that is the meeting, that is the intermeshing of mind and nature. That is the step that we will take so that we can rejoin this beautiful ecology and no longer be destroying it.
An ecology of mind.
An ecology of mind. Cool. Hey, so what's up next? We're going to edit in a piece of video that Richard shot of a music gig that we played at Strawberry Festival in 2010, and it was on a real, you recall, it was on a real, like, conscious convergence kind of day, mind calendar kind of day. It was really, really interesting. But just check the beautiful color in this thing. The color rendition is just dino, and we'll have our good friend Rich Hart up in front in the center of the screen. Beautiful guy with beautiful energy. This is an old song and legend tune called Black Forest Picnic. So my good friend Patrick McManus is here, and we are going to talk a little bit about how we ended up here today, and how this conversation about Gregory Bateson and epistemology and the history of science, how it's coming together, and what we're going to do with it from here on out. So remind me, if you would, how you discovered Gregory Bateson.
It was about 30 years ago at Evergreen State College when I was as an older student.
The Evergreen State College.
30-year-old student. I went to the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, in the USA. And so he was. There was quite a number of people reading Bateson stuff there, and so I didn't formally study Bateson, but I was very interested. I looked, I saw his books, and I bought copies of them, and I read them, and I started having discussions with other students about Bateson's ideas, and really, what's amazing and far-reaching about Bateson is this whole idea of, I'd never heard of epistemology.
Right.
And who has?
Right. Exactly.
You don't see
Exactly.
you don't hear epistemology jingles on the radio or TV or anything in education and so on, and it's such
the word wasn't even coined until I think the 19th century. I just found out.
Right?
I just found out in the last few weeks.
Yeah. So my understanding of epistemology and what it is, there's probably all kinds of definitions, and maybe another time we can go into some of these definitions and talk about the pros and cons of them. But epistemology is kind of the story of how we make up stories.
Yeah, the study of knowledge, how knowledge
Study
is
of
put
knowledge
together.
and how we organize it, how we
What we can reasonably expect from it.
yeah,
And how we keep it sane.
yeah.
You know, how nature is communicating, you know.
And you know, we look at our own personal. I look at my personal experience, and I grew up with the Catholic mythology. Was the orientation in my family and my community in the west side of Chicago, where I grew up, and so that was one layer, and it's not really explained. And I kind of, as a kid growing up, realized, oh, well, there's this other. Not everybody's Catholic,
Right. Yeah. Right.
and you know, when you try to imagine, well, what is it like to be not part of your group or not part of
majority.
A majority or a large group, and try to imagine a different set of mythological stories, because that's what it's all about. It's a whole set of reinforcing stories.
As time goes by, I'll be elaborating more and more on how the epistemology or epistemography works, how we apply it to whatever subject, whether it's music or carpentry or biology or whatever. And I'll start with one this time. An example of how the epistemology can be applied in a very insightful way. And this has to do with the question that I had for many, many years. And I suspect you may have had the same question, and that is, why do men have nipples? So let's apply the epistemology to this question of why do men have nipples. Our biological science, our medical science, describes things in terms of the following. When the human egg gets fertilized, one of two conditions can result. One is that what's called an XX pair of chromosomes ends up in that fertilized egg, and in another condition there's an X and a Y pair. So in the XX case, what happens is one of the X's gets turned off by some mechanism or another, and I really want to find out what that is, but one of the X's gets turned off and the other one goes to work, and makes a female, what we call a female. Nothing particularly controversial about that. Okay, so in the other case, the same thing happens. The X goes to work, making a female. And it turns out that the Y chromosome is a time delay factor that kicks in later in the development of this female and morphs that female into what we call a male. So the way I illustrate this then with the logical ecology structure is I'll draw a broken line right here and say that the female and the male represent different logical levels. They represent different levels of structure in the system, in the biological system. The male and female are not opposites, they're not complements, they're different levels of structure in a system. The male is a further differentiation of the female and a subset of the female. The reason that I draw a dashed line in here is to indicate that although these levels of structure have some uniqueness about them, they aren't separate from each other. So the divided line says, yes, there is this distinction that we can make, but they aren't really separate from each other because they're defined in terms of each other. So I would label this distinction logical level 2, and this one logical level 1, and the epistemology goes on from there to make various different distinctions. But I like to point out that the word female is derivative of the term male, obviously. And I would argue that that is archaic mind control content. That is old. That's an old distortion, an old lie about how biology works that it's time to put an end to. So this is a new piece of art that I've just finished. It's one of my favorite things I've ever made in my life. I collaborated on this with my good friend Gabriel Smith. He and I are making these things. We're having so much fun. So Gabe does the fine finishing on the wood, which is just lovely, lovely to touch. And then we both have our own bead design overlays that go with it. And this is one that I made for my Aunt Eloise Smith, who's living down in Greenville, South Carolina, in an assisted living place. And she's always been a big supporter of mine, and I always like to send her art. So this one is Eloise's salmonberry slingshot. So what I've done with the beads and shells and the like is to tell a little story for Eloise about what's going on here. And again, this is a piece of salmonberry that we harvested out of a thicket, an overgrown thicket. And so we don't have salmonberries back in North Carolina where I'm from. And Eloise lives in South Carolina. We don't have them there. We have blackberries though. And so what I have here is the rain falling in the Puget Sound, and here's the water in the sound with the salmon in it. Okay, and then there's the green coming on to land, and then we have the salmonberries growing. Okay, so these beads are pink like a salmon, but as we know out here, the salmonberries are actually sort of orange, yellowish orange. They're absolutely beautiful to look at. It's one of my favorite colors. I dye with that color a lot anymore. Okay, so there's the salmonberries growing. And then we cross over the island, and boom, we're back in the Colvos Passage here. Let's see, yep. With more water and more salmon on the west side of the island, and then over onto the Olympic Peninsula. So on the other arm of the slingshot, I was at Granny's, and I found this wonderful necklace that had these salmon-looking fish on it and these brim looking fish. And brim are a southern fish. They're a lot like a perch. And that's what we used to fish for a lot. My Uncle Jay used to fish for those a lot. So I got that necklace, and then I went into Granny's and I got this awesome necklace with red clay beads on it. And if you've ever been to the South, you know that red clay is everywhere. So I got the brim and the red clay going on. And then my aunt and uncle spent a lot of time at the beach, so I morph it slowly into a beach scene here. Let's see. Very good. Yeah. And so there are beads representing the sand, and then there are whelk shells along the beach there. So the beads code the Fibonacci series, which is that the number series that nature likes to create things with, for a very good reason, I would argue, and I'll be talking about that in an installment really soon. So not only is the Fibonacci series coded in there, but you can see the shells become more and more differentiated as the Fibonacci series moves along there, and then boom, we're in the Atlantic Ocean now, where the mullet are running. I love you, Eloise. So you can see we're also playing the glass bead game with this slingshot. These particular sorts of beads give really interesting distinctions that look just like logical levels. So as I mentioned, my friend Gabriel Smith and I are making slingshots together, and we're calling his gig Gabriel Smith's Fine Slingshots, and here's a piece of art that we're working up for that. So the slingshot has become this real icon for me, this real Vashon icon. Right there's the V. And another subject that we've been talking a lot about comes from Arthur Koestler's book, The Act of Creation. And what that idea is, he encapsulated with a French idiom that is, I'm going to try it. I have a go at it. Reculer pour mieux sauter. Okay, and what it's about is that little step back that you take before you jump over a creek, right? It's that pulling back of the pouch of the slingshot, the pulling back of the bowstring. And one thing that I'll talk about at length as we get into the epistemology is that this backing up is a very common evolutionary strategy in nature, where some natural system gets down at the end of an evolutionary experimental line and realize, oh, things are not working so well. So the systems de-differentiate themselves, they back up, they look to an earlier state where things were working more effectively. That's essentially the dynamic of stem cells, for one thing. It's also how great so-called scientific leaps are made forward. You rewind the tape. This is what Einstein did. He rewound the tape to see what Newton's presuppositions were. He changed those and then built another system that we'll talk about some. So, okay, we have Vashon, Reculer pour mieux sauter, okay? And then there's another archetype that shows up with this particular piece, and it comes from complexity theory, from the theory of emergent structures, how the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. And part of the premise from complexity theory is that when natural systems, whether it be a single cell or a forest ecosystem or a political economy like we're embedded in at the moment, any of those systems, when they're creating too much disorder within themselves, they're driven to the edge of chaos, because only at the edge of chaos is the system flexible enough to restructure itself to the degree that's necessary to deal with the new conditions, new challenging conditions. And one of the features of that emergent leap is what is referred to as a bifurcation, okay, a splitting. So part of the system in these instances will go into higher states of chaos and disorder, but part of the system goes into higher states of integration and functionality. And there's the argument in emergence theory that that is the dynamic of evolution.
Good fun.
If you so choose, close your eyes. Okay, so in a minute, or a few seconds, I'm going to ask you to open them. And what I'd like you to place your attention on is how quickly your visual system makes a picture of what's in front of you. Okay, again, I'll repeat that again. So notice how quickly your eyes and brain and whatever else is involved, electromagnetic field off the heart, the whole deal, how quickly it forms an image. Okay, open your eyes. Very quickly. So a lot of the processes that we're going to be talking about with regard to the epistemology and how we apply it to our own real-time information processing, life process as it goes on. So let's talk about, we'll jump back in the conversation we were having a minute ago, and that is we choose to model the information processing in the body, for this example, as a three-level structure where we had the viscera, the tissue at one level, we have the emotional level, and then we have the mental level, three different levels for purposes of talking about it. So we're all aware of how quickly physical distress at the visceral level can jump to emotional distress at the emotional level at the next level up. Okay? And that process happens super fast, just like your eyes making a picture of the visual environment. It happens very quickly. So the protoplasm, the cells, the nervous system, protoplasm has been on this planet for a long time, and it has been encountering different sensations and giving it the thumbs up or the thumbs down for a long time. So our bodies, physical bodies, and all the other creatures that are in there execute that information processing step really quickly. And the body will, give it the thumbs up or thumbs down really quickly. And I'm convinced that what the Buddha was talking about when he talked about letting go of attachment to desire and aversion, I think what he is talking about was observing that protoplasm response and not attaching to it, not let that negative thing boot up into an emotional distress that then boots up into a mental storytelling about how horrible things are that makes the other two levels worse and blah. You get that whole negative feedback loop going. So,
and what really becomes difficult and tractable about that is the habit of attention that starts right there. The habit of right. It's like, so you're talking about visceral distress and emotional distress, and as soon as we get into making a judgment about it, and instead of making a larger logical or higher logical observation as you requested in this little experiment we just did a couple of minutes ago, then we could make a decision. Well, what can I do with my attention? Because one of the the means of people suffering with this thing is how attention grabbing.
Exactly. Okay, so let's build out some context around this, and this comes from personal observation for a long time, and then it got reinforced through the Gnostic scholar John Lash's book that I've been talking so much about. And his book is the telling of the story of his interpretation of the history and evolution of what was called the Gnostic intellectual culture. The culture that created the classical world, the pyramids, the seven wonders of the ancient world, all this stuff that we can't do now. The intellectual culture is what he says the Gnostics were. And a fundamental part of their epistemology was that they had a multiple self model for identity. Okay, there was not a single. Okay.
Interesting.
Okay, so
interesting.
It makes sense from another, we can double describe it from another context, in that the most complex thing that human beings do, arguably, is have relationships with other human beings.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
it is so
Sure.
impossibly complex, and we take it totally for granted, right? Because
Exactly.
nobody ever talks about
Exactly.
it in that way,
It's
right?
been so difficult to model and understand, etc.
Right. Okay. So if the mind is driven to model that, if that's its most challenging task, then the whole modeling thing is about creating a structure that is similar to that which is modeled.
Right.
Okay. So the mind itself, if it's modeling a community of quite freestanding but interactive individuals, the mind itself is going to be of that same structure.
Relationship.
A whole community in there.
With other relationship with the community of mind.
Right.
Internal community of mind.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
the fractal resolution,
Yeah.
the mapping of it, right?
Well, we have there's people that have multiple personalities. We have multiple personality disorder, but this is
Okay, well,
something
okay,
entirely different than
Right,
what
right,
we're talking
right,
about.
and-
How
and-
is this different?
And what I'm talking about is entirely non-controversial. Okay, we just don't notice it. Okay, you're walking to the door, you're going to the grocery store, you turn the handle, you open the door, and this voice goes, "Don't forget to mail that letter at the post office." Okay, where did that come from? Right? Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, where did that obtuse memory from the third grade that just showed up on the screen, where did that come from?
Yeah.
Okay, so if instead we model the conscious mind as the screen on which all these other processes are throwing up content all the time, and it's quite sophisticated content, right?
Yeah.
The whole notion of remembering that this letter needs to go on this trip and all this stuff is very complex processing. Okay, so with this challenge of not letting physical disturbance create mental disturbance, we're aware that we're looking at a tiny slice of time there, and that's the challenging aspect of it. Is it fires off so fast?
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, and then it's here's something lovely about this, and what you're saying is that we're living in a time now where this very conversation is being recorded by a man with a camera out there, and we can use this actual physical thing that we have with these cameras, and we have them in our phones and everywhere else, as a metaphor. For looking, well, where am I pointing my attention, camera?
Right.
However you want to. How am I using that? What's going on? Does that have anything to do with how intractable this discomfort that I've judged?
The seeming untractable.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you do then, okay, is have a non-conscious part of the mind, okay, watch that tiny little time interval for you, and that's that individual's only task. Okay, is to watch for that tiny little time interval when that jump from it feeling bad down here starts to things getting tumultuous here, right? Or however we feel that emotional distress level kick in, right? So you have that non-conscious part of the mind go, okay, the instant that happens, you shoot a message up on the conscious screen. Okay, and what I will do is I'll find that point of distress and I'll pull it with my breath, or I'll poke it with my finger. Okay, I'll physically disrupt. Okay, its patterned form.
So you're looking at a location in your body that's feeling distressed associated with certain distressful thoughts.
Right. Okay. It's interrupting that loop.
Okay.
And
the way you're looking specifically, you have the handle that you're grabbing is this part of your mind that's non-conscious that is scanning. Where am I noticing something at some point where I'm feeling discomfort in my body? A location.
Yeah.
Specificity is very important.
Location. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's a tiny slice of time. Okay, so it doesn't take much circuitry.
Sure.
To do it. Okay, and what I do is I'll get by myself. Okay, because I talk out loud to
yourself.
to that part. Okay, to the other parts. Right, it's vital to talk out loud
To yourself.
to yourself. Okay, the whole taboo about
Okay.
that is about reserving that channel for other people. Okay. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, I
Okay.
say,
'Cause
or
there's
the
no good
authorities that are trained you to it.
Quote, you know. So, so right, it's all about catching those tiny little slices of time, and then when that signal comes, you act on it.
Yeah.
Okay, as Jung said, the non-conscious parts of the mind will respond to bargaining. Okay, so you make a deal. It's like, okay, you know, if you will kick that message up on the screen for me, I will act on it. Okay, and it works like a charm, and none of this, you know, having to focus the conscious mind on the problem and try and figure it out, because that's
No,
not
that's
gonna work.
well. Then it's again that gets back to what am I doing with my attention?
Right,
You know,
right.
where am I pointing the camera? What settings have I set this camera? Have I set it? You know, it's like, am I just looking at things impressionistically, where I'm not really seeing, well, what's a deeper level to what I'm feeling here? Where's that coming from?
Right.
So anyway, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, the conscious
What
mind.
is this like?
The conscious mind is operating at a very slow pace relative to all this other stuff. Right? And working on the dragon is when it really became apparent to me how slow it is, because we're using those beat frequencies, right? And you can hear it go wow, 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 wow. Okay, the stuff of conscious brain operation is really slow.
Yeah.
Really slow.
Well, mine is.
A central Batesonian concept. You know, again, he was trying to discover ways of thinking about how nature thinks, about how nature processes information and maintains structure and integrity and coherence. And one very basic principle that he pointed out, he calls double and multiple description. And he said that anytime a biological system, there's some information that it really needs and is really important, it will get multiple copies, multiple versions, not copies, but multiple versions of that information. Okay, so we have two eyes. And because we have two eyes, we get two slightly different pictures of the visual environment. And our nervous system compares those two and creates another species of information that we call depth perception. Right? So we have these two visual things at one logical level that are compared, and boom, this new species of information gets created. So that's what we call a step in abstraction, a building of knowledge. The same thing happens with our ears. Okay, we know, boom, the sound came from that way, because we have two ears, so we get two impressions of the sound environment, and that signal hits this one a fraction of a second before it hits this one, and it hits this one with more sound pressure than it hits this one. So the nervous system is able to go, okay, the sound came from that way. Okay, so again, the nervous system is abstracting information. These two sound signals are compared, and boom, the direction from which the sound emanated, this new species of information gets created. So we're talking about building on this camera analogy, and how do we, boom, shift around and look at something from another perspective. And one of my favorite ways of doing that is that whenever I get interested in something new, like the harmonic series or Bucky Fuller or whatever, some music guitar thing, I'll go out and read absolutely every person that I can find, because you never know, you know, what book is going to give you some little, you know, sentence that just, you know, is this hugely valuable chunk of insight that you've got. So look to different sources for information, and you know, again, as Bateson said, in the context of like, say, reading history, is like that same depth of perception that happens in the visual context happens in our mental context as well. So these sampling of different sources, different cultural models, all this creates a depth of insight. So another big chunk of the natural philosopher effort, as you may have noticed, is tie-dye art. I learned to make tie-dye, I guess, about 2 years ago, and have just absolutely been going nuts over it. I absolutely love it. And there's a couple of things that have gone on with it that have really allowed me to mesh it with the rest of the natural philosopher effort. And first of all, that is dyeing fabric that is color coordinated relative to the color scheme that I use on all my music and math stuff. So for instance, this piece right here that has this beautiful blue violet down the middle is dyed in the key of A major. And I pull off the 7 colors that correspond to the scale notes and boom, onto fabric with it. And the results really do the trick for me and a lot of other people so far as well. So there's that aspect. And then another really inspiring aspect of it for me is that it's become this profoundly good model for coming to understand the effects of our actions in the world. The way a piece of tie-dye works is that this piece, for instance, I did the traditional tie-dye accordion fold and then dyed a pattern on it that corresponded to the musical scale, as I mentioned. And so what happens is we get to exert our will on this aesthetic medium, on this piece of art. And I made this very simple pattern that I assure you was much less complex than what you're looking at right here. And then that pattern, once it hits that, that pattern I implied to it, once that pattern hits this larger construct, kaboom, look what I made. And our actions in the world work the same way, whether it's our relationships with people. We never know the way that the effects of what we do are going to variegate and change and make things better for people and all that. And then, of course, there is ecological interaction with the environment and the realization that, we built this nuclear power plant, now we've got all this waste to deal with, and we had all the waste that it took to build the thing in the first place, and all these things that are supposedly side effects, we realize it's just an abuse of language, really. This is one of my favorite natural philosopher artifacts. And as Bucky Fuller said, people like artifacts, so I make them. This is a piece that I call Three Rocks, after a magnificent rock formation on the Oregon coast that's at the mouth of the Salmon River at Camp West Wind, the wonderful Camp West Wind. So what we see here are 3 donut-shaped magnets, and we can see that they're acting in repulsion. Okay, and I've got them on this stainless steel clevis pin that they're writing on there. So let's imagine that the north face of this magnet is up and the south pole of it is down. Okay, so because these two are in repulsion, we know that the north face is down here and the south face is up here. Okay, so these two again are in repulsion. So if this is the south, this is the north, and is that right? No, this is north, this is south. So this is south again, and this is north. So we got north face up here and north face up here. So these two are in the same polar relationship. And for that reason, I also call this piece As Above, So Below. Because when we take a point of reference in the middle, we see as above, so below, same magnetic polarity. Now this particular energetic relationship we can map on to natural phenomenon, we can map it onto Newtonian physics. And so let me give you an example. Here's my favorite example of talking about what this is about. Okay, so from the natural philosopher curriculum, okay, we're talking about 3 different logical levels of structure. And our particular example is in a natural ecology. And we're looking at the species level here, the local ecosystem level here and the climate zone level here. So 3 degrees of zoom out. And let's imagine that one spring the conditions in the climate zone are such that a bunch of grass and various other things grow such that the rabbit population starts to really grow. And what we know from our own personal experience is that nature is not going to then go to work and see how many rabbits it can make. What nature does is somehow to bring that rabbit population back into balance with what is going on around it. And I would say that's what we can model here. And so the local ecosystem is going to act to bring that rabbit population back into balance. And here we're modeling that with magnetic repulsion. Okay, the local ecosystem is going to act like a brake pedal on the growth rate of the population of the rabbits, and it's going to do it in various ways. It's going to do it at various logical levels. The fox population is going to go up because there's more fox food, and that's going to bring the rabbit population back down. The rabbit population will eat its way out of all this surplus food, so that will bring its population back down. So the local ecosystem acts like a brake pedal, whereas the general climate zone is still providing the overall conditions that those rabbits need to survive and to thrive. So these two levels are in positive feedback and in magnetic attraction, as we know. So what this little model is about is showing that we can think about how nature maintains balance is by having a brake pedal on the system and a gas pedal on the system. So it can slow itself down and it can speed itself up, as it were. And what we see is that the bias is towards the brake pedal. The brake pedal is closer than the gas pedal. And that makes good sense because slowing a system down is a much safer alternative than speeding it up and potentially going into runaway feedback. So again, 3 rocks, as above, so below. Another 3 logical level system and one of the fundamental tools that I use in my Natural Philosopher adventure. Okay, so we'll talk real soon about basic Newtonian physics, and we'll map this same structure onto the calculus-based physics of Newton and Leibniz, and that'll be good fun. Okay, see you soon.
I make it very explicit throughout the content of the Natural Philosopher, and I want to do it very regularly within this conversation as well, and that is to make the point that all of this stuff, all the content, is a story told from a particular point of view, and the aesthetics of that point of view just happen to be some that appeal to me personally and work in the larger picture for me. And one of the points of perspective that I like to come back to real regularly, remind myself and the people around me, is that I don't know how I got here. I don't know how I got in this body and on this planet. And everything is provisional until I get an answer to that question in lots of senses. So that point of view allows me to take all these stories and relate to them just as being stories and not some final definition of what truth is or some epistemological mess like that. So if you happen to know how you got here on this planet in the body that you're in, and not just that you have a story that somebody told you about how it happened, but if you have personal experience with that, I'm real curious to hear various people's stories. I've spoken with a couple or 3 people who've told me really compelling stories that convinced me, judging from their body language and etc., that what they were saying was authentic. So I don't know how I got here in this body and on this planet, and this is a topic I'll be revisiting.